straight crossguards versus curved crossguards. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this seems like a super simple question, and I'm quite amazed that in my 10 years of doing these videos, I'm not sure that I've ever actually addressed this question before. Now, fundamentally, straight crossguards like this are something that come around in the late Viking era. Okay, this is an Albion Lancaster, in case anybody's interested. And straight crossguards come around at the end of the Viking era as we go into the Norman era, and are pretty much normal. However, by the time we get fairly early on, in fact, into the 11th century, we start to see already some people experimenting with curved crossguards. And in fact, there are some types of curved crossguard which are married to late era Viking lobed pommels. So they were something which appeared really quite early on. They weren't something that necessarily develops in the 15th century or something like that. They were already around pretty much from the beginning of the kind of invention, as it were, of this straight crossguard. And we have to point out that straight crossguards were more common throughout the medieval period than curved ones were. Okay, so we have to therefore wonder, why did some people go for curved crossguards? Was it simply a matter of, that looks cool, let's do that? And that's always possible, okay? So fashion or just what someone liked the look of, that's always possible. And in many cases, it's possible that is the simple answer. But I think from using swords over the course of many years, 30 years plus, my opinion is that there's a little bit more to it than that. It's not only necessarily a case of what looks coolest, but it's also sometimes a question of practicality. Now, if we talk about practicality, we can essentially break it down into two things. That is fighting practicality and wearing practicality. Now, hopefully regular viewers of my channel will know that I regard the wearing practicality of swords pretty much as important in the evolution and design of swords across history as their actual combat effectiveness. Clearly, a blade that's hugely long or hugely heavy is not practical to wear around. A hilt that's incredibly long might be great on the battlefield, but you can't wear it around in your daily life. And equally, certain types of hilt, while they may have been used, some of them just aren't comfortable and aren't very practical to wear. So very often hilt design is also dictated by wearing practicality, not only what's best in a fight. So first of all, let's look at fighting practicality. What difference is there between a curled or curved guard and a straight guard? Well, the first thing that I'm going to say is that, and I think a lot of people watching this will have immediately thought of this, when you have a curved guard like this, it can trap and capture an opponent's blade more effectively in some cases than a straight guard can. Now, I have to caveat that slightly, but it depends what the nature of the attack is, and it depends what your accompanying weapons are. Whether it's a thrust or a cut, what type of weapon it is. It might not be a sword, it could be a spear or something like that. Or indeed, whether you're using things like shields or bucklers or offhand daggers and this kind of stuff. But we have to note something that's fairly obvious if we look at from basically the evolution of weapons across history, is that things that are curled up like this are very often designed like that to catch an opponent's blade. And the most obvious example from history is the main gauche, or left hand parrying dagger, used along with rapiers. So very often they have even more exaggerated guards than this. In fact, you know what? I can grab one because I've got one right here. So these have curled guards like this that are curved in two different planes in order to catch and control an opponent's blade. And clearly that is the primary purpose of a left-hand dagger used against a rapier, and usually with a rapier as well, because you're trying to control a long straight line that is thrusting at you repeatedly, and you're trying to control it, steer it, and hopefully capture it and control it for long enough that you can run your blade into them. So right off the bat, we could say that curved guards are possibly designed like that for that purpose. The only thing I would say is when it's your sword, rather than a parrying dagger where you can just parry with that while attacking with your sword, if you trap the opponent's weapon, inherently to some extent you are trapping your own weapon, because your primary weapon, let's just assume we've only got swords for example, or maybe sword and buckler, your primary weapon is now tied up with their primary weapon. So it's not as beneficial as it would be with a left-hand dagger. But that being said, There's certainly techniques known as winden in Lichtenau, for example, where sometimes we will interpose our weapon with an incoming strike or sometimes thrust and parry with the edge and catch the blade on the guard here at the same time as offending the person back, or it might purely be a defensive motion before we then riposte or offend them back. And in these situations, having a curved guard can maintain control over the opponent's blade, meaning that it doesn't pop off. Now, if you can absolutely do this with a straight guard, and in fact, statistically, it was done with straight guards more of the time. But in terms of a straight guard, it is more likely to pop off, it's less likely to get captured, and indeed, depending on the length of the guard as well. So a long straight guard will capture and control better than a short straight guard. Something like a Viking hilt practically can't do it at all. But if you've got a curved guard, or indeed something on the side like a shell or a nagel, that's the nail that sticks out of the side of a Langmesser, then that can assist also. Now we know that this point was also fairly important to medieval swordsmen, because very often on swords we have knobs or designs at the end of a crossguard which is designed to prevent things sliding off the end. So these types of knobs, while they might be ergonomic and useful in civilian life or just wearing around town, and I'll come back to that point in a minute, having something on the end here prevents the blade just sliding straight off the end and helps you to control. And it's very notable, even when we look at a curved guard like this, that they often have the exact same trapping elements. This incidentally is from one of the new batch 2 from the Royal Armouries line, which I'm working on at the moment. And in fact, I'm going to be at the Royal Armouries tomorrow, but nevertheless, this is a sword directly copied from one in the Royal Armouries collection, and it has this very characteristic style of terminal, as that is sometimes referred to as the end of each quillon, and that very much catches and traps things and prevents them just sliding off the end. In fact, there's another example from the Royal Armouries collection, and this is from the first batch, where it's a different type of crossguard and it is straight, but we in fact have these hooked and curled ends, and these are quite common, particularly in the late 14th and early 15th century, either curled around or 90-degree angles here. So it's clearly, it was important to them to not have a blade that does come down onto the crossguard sliding off the end. It's all about control, protecting your hands to some extent, and I'll come back to that point in a second, but also controlling your opponent's weapons so that while you're controlling it, you can stab them. Usually stab, sometimes cut, but usually stab. In other words, you can offend them while controlling their blade. So at this point, you might be wondering, why don't all swords have curved guards like this if they are better at trapping and controlling an opponent's blade? Well, there is one big disadvantage to these curved guards, and I have to say, in my experience of sparring with arming swords and side swords and rapiers and various other types of swords over the years, and long swords of course as well, I actually don't like these curved guards very much in use for one important reason. They expose the hand more. What do I mean by that? Well, if I just grab this straight guard for a second, you will notice that if we look at the angles here, the straight guard actually, in terms of the direction that a blow might be coming in from, protects the hand better than a curved guard. What do I mean by that? Well, if a blade is coming down at this angle here, in other words, if a cut's coming down here and I'm interposing my sword in the way in order to either do a winden of some kind, or a displacement, or a beat, or parry, or any of these actions where the blade's coming against the blade, this leaves an angle underneath the curve of the guard straight to my hand. Now you might think, oh, a hit on the hand, protective gloves in HEMA or bow hurt or reenactment or whatever, no big problem. Yeah, indeed, in armour, no big problem. Out of armour, really big problem, because basically of all the bits of my body which can take, let's say, a superficial cut, a cut that's not going to chop an arm off or a leg off or chop a head in half, but a blow that's certainly going to cut into flesh and possibly through finger bones, this is a really bad place to be hit, because this is the thing that controls the weapon. And hand hits, which are mentioned in the sources as being, you know, in some cases fight determining, are absolutely something you want to avoid. That's why they went into so much effort with later periods of swords, ultimately basket hilted swords, but swept hilts and cup hilts and knuckle bows and side rings and all of these things to protect the hand. In an unarmoured fight, the hand is super important to protect, and with medieval swords, simple hilts like this, you do it through placement, timing and angulation. But the fact is that having a curved up guard, while it might give you the advantage to bind against the opponent's blade, it exposes the hand more than a straight guard does. So for that reason, in fact, these types of guards, which are actually straight, but which have a little curl up at the end, in my opinion, are kind of the best of both worlds for a medieval blade, because they give you the coverage angle of the straight guard. In other words, they protect the fingers and the knuckles better than a entirely curved guard does, but they still have the curled up ends to give you the control over the opponent's blade in a wind, for example, and a bind, if you want that. Now, while we're on this topic, I should mention straight versus curved. It doesn't always pan out as simply as that. If we actually look at into a slightly later period, in fact, this starts in the 15th century. If I just grab any old sword here as an example, rather than necessarily having to have it straight on both sides or curved upwards on both sides, clearly it can't curve downwards on the backside because that would hit your arm, but it can curve downwards on the front side, and that gives you a rudimentary knuckle bow. And we exactly start to see this in the 15th century, and then a lot in the 16th century. We start to see the front guard bend around downwards to start to grow into the knuckle bow to give more protection to the front of the hand, and the back of the guard curves up to give that control point. And funnily enough, I've got some original examples behind here which actually show this feature. So let's grab this topmost rapier from up here. This feature starts out on forms of arming sword and storter and falchion, and stays around later even on cup hilt rapiers. And we can see this exact feature here where the back part of the guard is curled up. That's great for catching and control, parry and sict, for example. And the front of the guard curls around. In this case, it's not necessarily needed because you've got a knuckle bow as well. But if you didn't have a knuckle bow there, for example, that is now providing a lot of the protection of a knuckle bow. So they did realise at a certain point in the 15th century, and particularly done on falchions, because these were often being used by people without gauntlets, for example, that the front guard goes downwards to protect the knuckles, the back guard curves upwards. So sometimes you don't have to choose between straight or bend. So the final point I want to talk about is the practicality of wearing these rather than necessarily the practicalities of fighting. And an interesting thing that I've noticed over the years is that when walking around in a reenactment or living history context with straight guards, these often jab into things. Now, actually, this is not so bad because it's got curled around ends, so at least you've got a large surface area. In fact, if we go to this Castillon type guard here on the Albion, this has round knob ends, and equally if you're wearing it, that's more user friendly. At least it's not going to spike you. The types of guards which are very long and thin at the end can be really quite hazardous to wearing, to you, to your friends, and perhaps more importantly to your clothes. They tear holes in clothes and get stuck in things, they get caught on things. Even in combat, potentially, they could get caught in clothing and it could make it harder to get out. So you really don't want long, straight, pointy cross guards that are going to get stuck in things, either for your health or for your cost of your clothing. And one thing I've noticed when switching from a straight guard to a curved guard like this is actually these curved guards get stuck on stuff. In my experience anyway, your mileage might vary, and if it does, comment down below, but these get stuck on stuff far less because you're obviously wearing the sword hilt upwards, and these things just tend to slide off them because they're curving downwards, in other words in the direction of gravity. Things tend to kind of drape and slide off them and not get caught. And contrary to catching weapons when they're point up that way, when they're point down that way, things tend to slide off. And moreover, they tend also, because they're not sticking out at a straight right angle, because of the angle that a sword hangs at, they tend to be less offensive to banging into things and hitting things, be it your clothing or your own body. So I actually think from a usability point of view, these are quite advantageous. So, to summarise, in combat, I would say that curved guards do have one benefit, and that is catching and trapping blades. But that's pretty much the only benefit. The only other benefit they have is in wearing and practicality, and they can have some benefits in that regard as well, in not getting caught in things and not hurting people. Straight guards tend to provide better hand protection, but are not quite so good at binding and winding and trapping opponents' blades, and can get more caught on things and can be a little bit more uncomfortable to wear some of the time. If your kind of experience and your observations are different, or if you think I've missed something, obviously I'm happy to read that down in the comments below, and maybe that would lead on to a follow-up video. And also, perhaps in the future, we could look at how these guards, curved and straight, link into these later 16th, 17th century swords, some of which you see behind me here, and which clearly utilised some of the lessons learned from earlier medieval swords. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will be again next time, and I hope you'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.